Order, order. Thank you so much for coming before us today. It is always good for the Home Affairs Committee to meet the people who are running the departments, and so thank you for being with us. We've got a number of questions which will be quite varied, but I will try and make sure that we stick to time and we don't, we will stick to time, but we don't spend too long on any one area if we can avoid it. But I'm going to start with Sean Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome. Just in terms of the department's priorities and organisational structure, how has that changed since the general election this summer?
Thanks very much for this opportunity, Chair, and thank you to committee members for the questions. The Home Office is proud to have one of the five missions and two of the three foundations of this government. So all three big things that the Home Office does are well up there in terms of this government's priorities. So migration and the border, which is where the border security foundation comes from, policing and crime, which is where the Safer Streets mission is reflected, and then thirdly, what we call Homeland Security, which is the National Security Foundation. So I think that our structure maps on very well to the government's priorities since the general election at that sort of top level. Within that, we have moved people around, of course. Most quickly, we took the 1,000 people who were running the Rwanda scheme for the previous government over that first weekend after the election and put them onto other duties. And we've made other changes since then, for instance, building up the capability within the Safer Streets mission part of the department to reflect this government's prioritisation about things like police reform, halving violence against women and girls, halving knife crime, and so on, all of which are a higher priority, I would say, broadly for this government than in our previous structure.
Thank you. In terms of the outcome and delivery plan that other government departments have, I understand that the Home Office hasn't delivered one since 2021. Is that right? And do you plan to have a sort of formalised delivery plan?
We had an outcome delivery plan for each of the years under the previous government. I thought that they were published as well, so but I will check that. I'm pretty sure they were published annually and in our annual report and accounts where we sort of set out what we consider to have done under that outcome delivery plan.
Okay, I think the information we've received is that there hasn't been one published. It'd be helpful to see that when it is published. Do you think it's fair, the reputation that the Home Office has amongst some of being silo in its mentality and the way it approaches work with other Whitehall departments?
Well, I actually know where that reputation comes from. 5 years ago, I had never worked in the Home Office, and frankly, I had that view of the Home Office. Coming into it nearly 5 years ago, that was one of the first things that I wanted to shift. The Windrush review came out literally the week before I started this role, Wendy Williams's 30 recommendations, and underpinning those recommendations was a very significant recommendation to shift the culture of the department to make it more open and more joined up. So that was the direction of travel which I took on 5 years ago. I think we have made some good progress at the top level. I think the executive committee, so the permanent secretaries and the directors general in the department, are a very collaborative, unsiloed group of people who are collectively running the department. If you go one or two levels down, I think you could say the same thing. But the further down you go into the department, the more I think people feel their identity is to one part of the department rather than to the whole thing. And when it gets to questions in the People Survey annually about things like pride, what we see is that people are very proud of the work that they do, but they're not particularly proud of being in the Home Office as an institution. So they might be proud of being in Border Force Heathrow or Immigration Enforcement North East, but they're not particularly proud of the Home Office. And that is something that I and Simon and our colleagues on the Executive Committee have really been trying to work on over the last year. So I think work in progress, it's still there. We still have to work day in, day out to break down those silos and to join up with other parts of government.
Do you tend to ask other partners, either across Whitehall, other organisations, local authorities, others across the country, how they perceive the Home Office in their approach?
We do, and I'm very keen that we are a learning organisation. The only way you can learn is to know how you're doing, and that includes how other people think of you. So I've already mentioned the annual People Survey, which gives every one of our civil servants the opportunity to set that out. But we also do structured polling or assessing of views of other people. I think it remains the case that the Home Office is not That's straightforward. A partner for local authorities, for some NGOs delivering our services, and we are very keen to work on that to, as I say, learn the lessons of the Windrush report, make sure that that sort of scandal can never happen again, and that we're genuinely open to challenge, whether that comes from within or from one of our trusted partners outside.
Thank you, Sir Matthew. Sir Matthew, you've obviously been at the Home Office 5 years, and the perceptions that others have, you had when you arrived. Just in terms of the Windrush report, are you confident that the culture and organisation of the department now means that it would not be possible for those same mistakes to be made again?
I am very confident that those mistakes will not be made again. We also, of course, though, are seeking to prevent anything like a scandal like that happening again in any part of the department. That is an ongoing challenge. It is, as you know, a large department. It is dealing with complex work. It is dealing with politically sensitive work. And a large part of it is casework, where, thousands and thousands of decisions each year can be made, and only one or one small group of them going wrong would amount to a crisis. So that is the work that we are doing to make sure we have the quality control, the systems in place, but also the capability within the workforce, so the sort of systems and the capability, so that not only can a Windrush crisis not happen again, but nothing like that could happen again. I think that is very, very hard to absolutely guarantee that we won't have that, but rest assured that the top official team and the ministerial team are working really, really hard to prevent that sort of thing ever being able to happen again.
Just coming towards the end of my questions, in terms of the culture and the confidence of people to speak up within the Home Office, but also amongst partners, if they do see things that are culturally wrong. Obviously, we're having an inquiry into asylum hotels at the moment, and there's a huge amount of concern around some of the operations that are taking place. Do you feel that the organisation under your leadership has the culture to be able to genuinely speak up, and when people do speak up about concerns, that those are acted upon in an appropriate way?
I really do, but I know that there is further to go. In the most recent People survey, for instance, I think there was an uptick in the number of people who did feel safe to challenge, but there was no increase in the number of people who felt that if they did make a challenge, that something would happen as a result. So that really absolutely gets to your question. I think there is much further to go on that. I think that work will never be fully complete. So I think we have to keep going to genuinely instill a sense that challenge is a right. One should be able to challenge it, but it's almost an obligation, I would say. If you are an expert and you can see something going wrong in your area, I would hope that you would feel compelled to doing something about it. Raising your voice. You will be backed if you raise something constructively. So I have a mantra about maximum challenge before ministers take a decision, and then maximum implementation and delivery after they have decided it. And obviously that's very simplistic, but as a sort of starting point for a debate about challenge, I think it's a sort of good way in, and so that people really should be challenging not just ministers actually, but senior officials, each other, and the same applies for people outside the department as well, before things get locked down. Once things are locked down, then broadly speaking, the job of the civil service is to get on and deliver. Even when you're delivering, though, you can challenge how you're delivering. There might be a better way within your part of the business where you can improve things even after a decision has been taken.
And just finally, when I look at the missions of the government and those that are owned by the Home Office together with the priorities, all of them require a huge amount of partnership work across quite all departments, organisations up and down the country. But it takes two to tango. Is the Home Office, does the Home Office have the culture and the mindset that it can't just deliver these things by itself? It does genuinely need to empower and cooperate with others to do so?
I think I give a version of the same answer as previously, that I am proud of the progress we have made on that score, but we have absolutely not completed that journey. There is definitely further to go. I think we have very good relationships at senior levels with, for instance, the Ministry of Justice and the rest of the criminal justice system, and you would expect that given the day-to-day working that we have to do. And I think you saw the benefit of that during the widespread disorder in the summer in terms of the response of the criminal justice system. But as your question implies, we also need to be just as strong at working with local authorities, including in Simon's areas, with our colleagues in education and health. I mean, one of the big, I'm sure we'll come on to it later, the consequences of the Southport tragedies. Joining up across the system is a never-ending task, and we need to be much better at it.
Thank you, Sir Matthew.
Just a couple of points. So we've just checked in terms of the outcome delivery plan. The last one was published on the gov.uk website is June 2021 was the date of publication. So you might want to check whether it's just not made it to gov.uk or if there's something else there. But I just want to pick up on the point you made about people are proud to identify with Border Force at Heathrow, but not. Is it because they don't feel they're part of the Home Office, or is it that they're embarrassed about the Home Office?
I really hope that no one is embarrassed by the Home Office, though I expect one or two people are. I think that, it is such a large organisation, and the way that we run it, we don't want people to suppress their other levels of identity. I think Border Force is a very strong organisation with its own brand, literally its own uniform, and the people who wear that uniform are quite rightly proud to work for Border Force. I think Border Force is all the stronger by being a part of the Home Office. Of course, in previous times, not while I was in the department, but in previous times it has been totally separate, and that doesn't solve the problems that we need to solve. And I think the way that Phil Douglas, the DG of Border Force, has run Border Force over the last few years has been very much integrating with Simon and myself as part of the Home Office. So he is a member of our executive committee, just as the other DGs are. So I think it's a mixture of different things, part of which I am very, very keen to change, which is to have on top of that level of strong Border Force identity, in addition, a strong Home Office level of identity.
Thank you. Chris Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, both of you, for coming to the committee again. I want to ask you some questions about staffing, if I can. So, in the 5 years that you've been Permanent Secretary, the Home Office spending is now 86% more. 86% more than it was 5 years ago, 53% more in real terms, to 2.9 billion. Although we can see that in asylum support, resettlement and accommodation, which is obviously one of the big priorities of the government now, staff headcount is going down by 3,500. So I wonder if you could explain why that is.
Absolutely. So in big picture terms, in the time that I have been in the department, the total size of the civil service in the Home Office has gone from 35,000 up to a peak of 53,000 a few months ago, so that is the 80% uplift that you talked about, and it's now on its way down, so it's now 51,000 and reducing. That's the total. Within that, some parts have gone up or down, at different times, but that on average, that's what's been happening. The three big reasons for the increase were, first of all, COVID. The pandemic put different requirements on the Home Office. Secondly, the UK's exit from the EU, particularly at the border, that had additional responsibilities that we didn't previously had. And then thirdly, different immigration policies at different times have required extra case workers to do different parts of the thing. There are other changes as well, but the whole department, I think, knows that 53,000 is too big and that we therefore are on the way down. Within that, Simon and I have set requirements for different parts of the department, so it's not a blanket, everyone's got to reduce by 10% over the next year or anything like that. Because that leads to some perverse incentives. And in fact, there are some parts of the department which actually need to carry on growing, including immigration enforcement, if we are to do all of the returns and the raids of illegal working and things like that. We need more people on that side. Whereas other parts, like, broadly speaking, the things that can be digitised, so a lot of the border, a lot of the case working, you would expect those numbers to go down over time. So our projections for the future do require some investment ongoing in technology in order to digitise the border or the case working functions, to take those two examples still. But if we are able to achieve that, then I would fully expect that 51,000 total number to carry on coming down through this year and next and beyond.
Okay, but why is asylum support and resettlement and accommodation going down against the grain of every other department, every other component?
So Simon might want to come on this area. So in this area, this government, as indeed its predecessor, had a policy to exit hotels and to spend less on asylum support than we were previously. The Treasury have given us some challenging targets in that area for the rest of this year, for the next financial year, and no doubt they will do the same through the spending review for the 26-7 year onwards, and that is why those numbers are coming down. Simon,
yes, the only other thing I'd add is as we get on top of asylum casework and bring the backlog down, we reduce the amount of casework in that area that we need to do. We can move caseworkers around the department into other areas where we need to do more work, where we've been growing our casework teams, for example, removal of foreign national offenders.
Okay, so you're getting through the backlog so swiftly that you can take out basically 3,300.
We haven't taken all of that's not the number of caseworkers we've taken out of asylum. So I was giving you an example of how we can reduce the numbers. Some of that is through changing, as Matthew says, the technology and the base on which we're doing things, but also the volume of work we've got in different areas moves over time. We had to build up our asylum caseworkers very significantly through 2023 to get to the point to reduce the legacy backlog. At that point, we are now in the process of reducing the asylum backlog, and we can move caseworkers back out. We also reduced caseworker numbers that were geared up for the Illegal Migration Act, which we are obviously now not implementing under the new government.
Thank you. Could I also ask about the consultancy work and the temporary workforce that you use? So the Home Office spent £500 million on its temporary workforce last year, so that's roughly a sixth of your staffing budget. Do you think you're over-reliant on a temporary workforce?
So there's a sort of good part of that and a bad part of that, if you like. The good part is if people come in temporarily because there's a summer surge or a winter surge or whatever, a seasonal requirement, then they would typically come in on a short-term contract, and that would be reflected in some of those figures. That's the good part. I think that is, if you like, flexibility in action. The bad part is an over-reliance on consultancy, and this department, along with, I think, all other government departments, are part of the manifesto commitment to halve consultancy spend. I think it's over the course of this Parliament. And so now we have higher thresholds in place before we are prepared to authorise contracts in relation to consultancy. We do still need consultants on some very important parts of work. There are some skills which we just do not have in the civil service and wouldn't pretend to be able to grow them at the pace required to do the work. So in those sorts of areas, it's quite right to be able to spend some money on consultants. But by and large, I would say there is a bit of a culture of over-reliance on consultants, and that is something that we are now beginning to repress as part of that halving commitment.
Do you think it's more than just a little bit of an over-reliance? Because when we look at Home Office consultancy on things like North Eye, the National Audit Office said that you put in place arrangements to oversee work of contracted staff, and because they gave you incorrect advice, you had to pay £0.9 million extra because the consultancy advice you were getting wasn't correct. There was also the 6-week time frame that consultants applied to the contract, which you've acknowledged. Then it ended up costing you more money for every 6 months. And the Home Office itself has acknowledged that you lack the capacity to assess the agreed terms the consultants had agreed for you. So it's not just about an over-reliance, isn't it? It's about procuring something that isn't fit for purpose.
Yes, I agree with that, and I gave evidence to your colleagues on the Public Accounts Committee in relation to that that issue. And I can't remember exactly what I said, but broadly speaking, I agreed with the National Audit Office that we needed greater expertise in-house, and actually even from as long even over the last year or two, never mind in recent months, we have actually been increasing our in-house capability to, for instance, be able to acquire accommodation where necessary, rather than using external consultants to do so. But so yes to all of that. There are other occasions when it wouldn't be the best use of public money to build capability within the civil service. If it's a very particular technical bit of expertise on, I don't know, the IT underpinning the police national computer, for instance. There is a very small number of people who know how that works, given it was been running for 50 years. We're busy updating it, putting it all on the cloud and so on. But some of that expertise you would not expect to find within the civil service. So that would be an example, I would say, of a reasonable use of public money to buy in consultant spend.
Absolutely. And my question wasn't driving at the principle of consultancy in general. I accept that in some occasions it's absolutely appropriate. I was more trying to drive at the times when the Home Office is using temporary staff for consultancy and not getting what it wants for money. So I suppose, given that we have some quite clear examples that the Home Office itself has admitted to, we've got North Eye, but there are quite a few examples over recent history where Home Office money hasn't delivered on consultancy. And on that procurement of special services, could you tell me a bit about what happens when you realise that? In particular, the people who manage these contracts, what happens to them when it's clear that they've failed in their capacity to do that, and significant amounts of public money have been lost? Or when contracts have been agreed that the terms of which then expand and expand and expand over the course of the contract cost far more than they were ever envisaged at the outset? What do you do with people when it's clear that the procurement processes have failed? Do they get exited from the Home Office? Do they stay in their role? Do they get promoted?
Let me respond, and then Simon might want to add. I mean, the short version of what happened in that particular case is the person the person who was a consultant but working for the Home Office exited. That is relatively rare in the civil service. I admit I would like to see a much more robust performance management system where people do take responsibility and in worst case scenarios do leave in much more frequency. That is the culture that I would like us to be moving towards. When we do procure external consultancy, as a general rule, one of the conditions for accepting the recommendation and the contract is that there is some sort of knowledge transfer into the civil service from the consultants or the other experts who we're procuring. That is, as a general rule, it's okay, I think, to buy in a capability that we don't have, provided there is some passing on of that expertise from the external consultants into the civil service. That's a general principle. And then, in the other part of your question, the department is doing things which a few years ago we weren't. 5 years ago, there wasn't a huge accommodation requirement for asylum seekers because the number of asylum seekers in the system was smaller than the amount of accommodation in the private rental market, for instance. So the whole area of running hotels or large sites under the previous government or other types of accommodation is a relatively new function. And so we are building up our ability to run that function effectively, almost from a standing start.
You're comfortable then with the level of performance management that's currently taking place? You don't think there is a case for toughening that at all?
No, I think there is a case for toughening, and there's also performance management obviously within each contract. So to carry on with that example on asylum accommodation, each of those contracts, they're huge contracts. Each of them has a dedicated contract manager in the Home Office whose sole job is to run that particular contract. Each of them has 10 key performance indicators. Whenever there are breaches of any of those performance levels from the contractor, there are service credits which can be withdrawn by the Home Office, so that there is a commercial penalty to our providers. But that's the framework, and I think that's what you would expect of a government department spending public money on these sorts of things. But I do think that we need to get more and more robust and rigorous at being able effectively to manage those contracts.
And then final question is, what are you doing to increase the representation of women, particularly at senior levels in the Home Office?
Well, I think we've got a pretty good story to tell, but not perfect. So there are 52% of our workforce are women overall. Within the senior levels, it's 47%. So it should be 50 or 52, but it's not quite. So there is a bit of a drop-off. So at the very senior level, so within the executive committee, at one point in my time, it was actually more than 50% were women, which I think was rare in Whitehall. It's actually changed slightly with just a small number of changes. But there is more and more that we need to do. I think visible representation is absolutely crucial for women, for people from ethnic minorities, for people from all underrepresented groups. And I would say women are an underrepresented group in general within the civil service. So there are actions that we can take within the law. So not positive discrimination, but positive action. Mentorship schemes, sponsorship schemes, giving people opportunities to be stretched, to have challenging roles, and giving those sorts of responsibilities disproportionately to, in this case, women. So all of that is underway, but none of that is meant to sound complacent because we have a reasonable story to tell, but there is more that we need to do.
And just to add, I'm very happy to be able to say at director level, which is the level immediately below the executive board, the last 3 recruitments in Border Force and IE were all women. Now that's rebalanced in the right direction, but we're seeing the benefits of the work that we're doing.
And that's significant. Border Force and Immigration Enforcement are uniformed parts of the Home Office. They are the pipeline into which people come to those parts of the department is overly male, as is the military, the police, other uniformed services.
Can I just ask, on the back of that, what horizon scanning are you doing? I'm just struck when you say that immigration asylum hotel accommodation was something that is a relatively new phenomenon. Are you working with agencies and partners to see where shocks might be coming down the line in the system that might require a change in focus in terms of the Home Office's priorities?
It's a really good question, and I'm glad to say yes, we are. Some of that is cross-government. So the Foreign Office do a product every year on the future of the world, and then each of us can then take that sort of global context and apply it to our own departmental objectives. The Chief Scientific Advisor network is also very strong in this area. So the Home Office has a Chief Scientific Advisor, and so do most other government departments, and together they are a network who either are really good at analysis themselves or know which academics and others to draw on to bring in expertise into government. And so that is a very fruitful source of horizon scanning. And then within the department, for this Home Secretary, we have set up a horizon scanning product, if you like, a weekly product. This is a much shorter term, but so as a radar, we call it. So what are the issues which are not yet on your radar, Home Secretary, but which need to be? So we have a way of making sure that we are sort of looking around the corners and spotting things, and we're seeking to do that not just in the short term, but also in the much longer term. Again, a bit like the previous answers, I mean, I'm glad we've done all that, but we absolutely cannot rest on our laurels. We have to constantly get better and better at doing this. The private sector is very good at this as well. So, finding ways to collaborate with partners, or, with some of the organisations we're working with anyway, doing it with other countries, because, some like-minded countries are good at this as well, and absolutely doing it with our agencies and with our operational partners. Because the threats that we are dealing with are changing fast. Technology is changing fast. The global context that we're operating in with the United States, with Europe, with China, all of that is changing incredibly fast and has a direct bearing on the big issues that the Home Office deals with, especially migration and national security and sort of transnational crime. Those are all very those are all trends which are likely to change significantly in coming years.
Jake?
Just following up on that, in terms of the horizon scanning radar, you mentioned other countries which are potentially doing this well. Are you able to say which ones? And also, how does that process work in terms of learning lessons from other countries? Is there a lot of informal dialogue, or is there a process by which that happens?
I would say it's mainly informal, and in this job the main international partners are the other members of the Five Eyes, so the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, along with the UK. Those are, if you like, sort of like-minded. There's a very strong intelligence sharing relationship, and that expands into many of the Home Office policy issues. Secondly, there's our near neighbours. And obviously, almost all of the migration into the UK comes from some combination of France, Belgium, Germany, Ireland in particular. So working with them and the European Union and other European institutions is incredibly important as well. And then thirdly, there are the sort of, if you like, the countries that are good at this sort of thing. And I would pick out Singapore as probably the best example from my experience. They, with a relatively small civil service, they are innovative, technology-minded, and good at organising themselves to do horizon scanning. So I haven't done it myself, but colleagues on the executive committee or peers from other permanent secretaries and other departments, have a strong relationship there and bring in those sorts of insights as well.
Around.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for joining us. I want to touch briefly on expenditure. Obviously, the government in a difficult financial position, and the budget outlined a planned £1 billion of savings in the asylum system. Just wondered if you could outline how that will be delivered and how confident you are that it will be delivered.
Absolutely. Simon will want to say more on this. Very confident that it will be delivered. This year, the savings are from ending the Rwanda scheme and reducing our use of hotels for asylum seekers. And we're very confident that we will meet the numbers required for the rest of this financial year. The same applies for 25-26, and then beyond that, we haven't yet done the spending round for those years. That said, I mean, it is, although I'm very, very confident about those savings, it is a very, very tight settlement for the Home Office. And, we're going to be coming in this year, sort of, I think, right on the wire. And next year, things are going to be tough. And broadly speaking, we are, in round numbers, we are trying to make some savings on the migration and asylum accommodation side of the department and then spend more on policing. So policing has had an over £1 billion uplift for the next financial year, and that is what is needed partly because of inflation and pay and so on, but also to do more, so to carry on doing what they're doing and to start recruiting the 13,000 additional neighbourhood police officers, for instance. So when you have a very high ambition, as this government has in this area, when you have a very strong focus on delivery, as we do, we have to make sure that the funding is going to the right places. But these are all very tough trade-offs and choices, and it is going to be tight, I would say, for the rest of this year and for next.
Okay, and of the £1 billion, in terms of the balance of the savings there, how much is saved by not proceeding with the Rwanda scheme vis-a-vis how much is expected to be saved from hotel accommodation?
So the Rwanda saving was 700 million for this year and 1.4 billion for next year. That was on the sort of previous government, compared to the previous government's projections. And then the hotel savings are 1.4.
Yeah, so we're seeking this financial year to save £300 million, and we need to save £700 million by the end of next year. The vast majority of those savings come from exiting hotels. That's where a lot of the cost is. We will do that through a combination of seeking to reduce the number of people we are accommodating, which is a function, in short, of intake and processing the casework more quickly, and there are some big challenges in that, but those are the sort of core lines of work, and then continuing to work with local authorities and our providers to increase non-hotel accommodation. The cost differential between hotel accommodation and non-hotel accommodation is very significant.
Okay, we'll return to some of those asylum accommodation issues. Thank you for that.
Because you said the hotel saving was 700 million by end of next year. Is that 700 million in year or 700 million including the 300 million this year?
It is 700 million including the 300 million this year.
It's 400 million next year.
It's bringing from our baseline the year before down by 700 million.
And likewise with Rwanda, was that 1.4 billion next year, or is it 700 million added to the 700 million this year?
That's a total cost compared to the plans of the previous
700 million each year, which is 1.4 together. That's fine. Just wanted to be clear whether it was doubling in the estimate was doubling in price, or was it the same? And just okay, Sean.
Just to clarify in regards to the billion figure, but also linked to the other figures that you mentioned, those are savings to the Home Office. When you net out the cost shunting to other government departments and to other parts of the state, what's your assessment in terms of what is the cost shunt? So the savings of the Home Office is one thing, but the savings to the overall taxpayer is another. What's the other?
So I mean, just to talk about asylum specifically, we are making the saving, as you say, against the Home Office budget. There is a relationship, particularly to the spend of local authorities, in terms of potential temporary accommodation costs as people who are granted asylum leave our accommodation and sometimes need local authority support. What we're doing there is working very closely with local authorities to try and minimise that and to smooth the path from our accommodation into work and being settled. We've done a couple of things. In December last year, we announced that we would only move people on after 56 days rather than 28 days. We have put a number of asylum move-on liaison officers in place to help work with granted asylum seekers to find their way to work and housing. In terms of the sort of precise costs around that, essentially we are working with MHCLG to just make sure that their projections for temporary accommodation costs are we've got shared assumptions in terms of the movement between our accommodation and any potential increases in temporary accommodation.
Just the example that you've given, clearly the other outcome is that a person is, as their claim assessed, and then is deported if they don't have a right to stay. So do the costs of you removing an individual, is it also net from that saving?
So yes, that's all inside the Home Office. So we're having to live within a control total altogether, and therefore we are allocating between immigration enforcement and the costs of removal and the asylum budget. So we are managing that inside our own budgets.
Can I just ask, how many hotels do you estimate you need to exit to make these savings? 300 million this year, 400 million next year.
So I mean, it's there's not a precise number on that, because it's a function of a range of different things. Hotels are sort of quite different sizes. We are obviously trying to make best use of the money we spend on hotels by maximising the utilisation rate. So what we are doing is work, as I said, across the different lines of effort of reducing intake, moving through the backlog, working with the Ministry of Justice to reduce the number of to move through the appeal system more quickly, and so on, in order to meet the number. So we've got a plan, but exactly how we meet it will vary depending on a whole number of factors.
And ministers will want to keep the committee and Parliament updated on the total numbers, which have fallen from over 400 to 218. But I don't think you should expect a sort of a gradual decline of that number down to zero neatly by the end of this Parliament. That's our aim, is to get to zero by the end of this Parliament, but it won't be. There'll be ups and downs.
Chris Murray.
Can I just come back on the point about the move on from hotel accommodation for asylum seekers, for refugees? So, by definition, if someone has moved on from home office accommodation, you have recognised they're a refugee. There will be vulnerabilities there. There'll often be people with children, people with adult social care needs, who local authorities have a statutory duty to provide accommodation for. And we know that every local authority in the country has massive problems trying to provide services and accommodation for the people to whom they have a statutory obligation. So you say minimise it, but can you maybe flesh it out a little bit more? I mean, hopefully it's more than just a couple of move-on officers being put in place, because there are really significant social tensions that could arise, because obviously someone with a statutory obligation will go to the top of a local housing queue, whereas other people may have been on it for a very long time, and that'll be politically very sensitive. And how much work are you doing with local authorities so they know exactly what that pipeline is going to look like? Because it can be very hard to know when the Home Office is going to make a decision on an immigration case, on an asylum case. So are you getting joined up with local authorities so they're not suddenly discovering a whole set of people to whom they have a statutory obligation?
Yeah, so we've done much more in the last 18 months or so. There is more we need to do, and while I think we have got moved some things in a much more positive direction, we definitely still have issues. We are doing a number of things. First thing we're doing is we meet regularly with regional migration partnerships and with individual local authorities. We are sharing increasing amounts of information and data about the accommodation we've got in different local authority areas and the people in there. We are trying to give the best indication we can of when numbers are likely to move on. We're not at the moment in a position to be able to say exactly when individual cases will come through the system in those areas, but we are sharing what information we have and having regular discussions about that. As I say, we've extended until at least the summer, the period of time from people receiving a discontinuation letter, as we call it, but the point at which they've been granted and they get notice that they'll leave accommodation, from 28 days to 56 days to give much more time to work with that individual and with local authorities. And the move-on officers are there to help us manage that communication on the ground between individuals, between local authorities, between other service providers. It's something that we did in 2023 when we moved a number of Afghans from hotels into more settled accommodation, and that worked well and was very much a joint effort between us, DWP, MHCLG and local authorities. So we're building that up in the asylum space. There's definitely more we need to do, but I think we're on an increasingly positive footing in that area, and we'll keep working to do it, because as your colleague said, there are costs that are borne if we don't get this right.
Margaret.
Thank you, Chair. Minor expenditure questions, really. So, as you mentioned earlier, 13,000 new neighbourhood officers and police, support officers. Obviously, the money has gone into it, but by your own kind of what you just said, it's going to be tight, really. So, in the first year, obviously, that will be easier, won't it, with the various police forces. The Home Secretary has also mentioned as well that she thinks there's going to be need kind of efficiencies as well. So beyond year one, do you think that is going to be possible on that delivery, and do you think that efficiencies can be found?
Thank you. Yes to both halves of that. So yes, it is possible, and that is what we are planning for, is to get to the 13,000 additional neighbourhood police officers by 3 years' time. By the end of the Parliament. And yes, it is also possible to make sure that there is more efficiencies from the police system. What we have found in this first year, so for the next financial year, that the efficiencies are not projected to be enough to fund the uplift that we want to get that programme started, which is why the Home Secretary has just announced not an additional 100 million, but an additional 200 million pounds as part of that extra 1.1 billion pounds for policing, specifically to get started on that programme, even though the police efficiencies aren't going to get up to that sort of level in this next year. But as time goes on, we're going to need to put more than that in each year in order to get to fulfil the 13,000 commitment, and policing is going to need to do a more ambitious job than previously at finding those efficiencies. So the way that the efficiencies part will work will be set out in more detail in the white paper on police reform, but in a nutshell, what there will be is a much stronger sense of a national centre of policing. And one of the things that national centre will be able to do will be to say, that for this particular contract, this is the way that you must all do it, not to have 43 different contracts, for instance. But we're going to need to go further than that as well, in order to make sure that the vast majority of funding for policing goes into the front line, and that there are significant savings from the support functions. So this is we haven't yet worked out with the 43 forces and their PCCs exactly the trajectory of the uplift for each of the forces. That will come in due course. But rest assured, we will absolutely keep going until we get there, fulfilling this commitment, just as we did actually for the previous government with their proposition to increase the total policing by 20,000.
So when this discussion is had, and I appreciate the white paper's got to come, we kind of only hear really about IT systems. They can't all have different IT systems. But it's going to have to be much more complex than that on the efficiencies if we're going to get to that, really, aren't we, on the budget?
Absolutely.
Obviously, AI as well, I assume, will have a part to play. And also, if for instance, like at the current time, the Met is struggling to recruit, and if they don't recruit and they don't have that, how will that play out, do you think?
So again, I agree with both parts of the question. On artificial intelligence, I remember when the Home Secretary was here, we were talking before Christmas about facial recognition, which is one example of AI in policing, and the additional £3 million of Home Office investment in that, within a context of regulation, of making sure that there is a sort of, if you like, an ethical framework. There's a lot of checking, and that in these frontier technologies that we don't go too fast, and that policing doesn't sort of go too fast either. But it is important that they invest, and that we invest with them in these new technologies. Because AI, as the Home Secretary was saying at the weekend, is a driver of some of the harms affecting our society, but it can also, as your question implies, also be a driver of some of the response to those harms and the protection of our society and of our citizens and of our children. So that is the investment that we are seeking to do with policing. Sorry, I've forgotten the other part of your question.
I was saying that when you talk about police, not you, but when police efficiencies are spoken about, the general point is made, everyone needs a different IT system and that kind of thing as well. That isn't going to cut it. We're going to have to. So how do you see that playing out?
Apologies for forgetting. Yes, so the efficiencies agenda needs to be wide and deep. And it cannot just be one bit of IT over here or one bit of procurement over there. It will start with IT and procurement and the fleet of helicopters and cars and things, and doing once rather than 43 times what can be done once. But I think it will need to go further and faster than that. But ministers have been very clear that we want to do this reform with policing, not to policing. And I think that is definitely the way to do it in order for it to be sustainable. And I think that so far, the impetus for particular efficiencies is absolutely coming from policing, and that's a really good thing. So I really want to incentivise that and continue that. We have a joint team working together, so the police literally alongside Home Office civil servants in the Home Office on the content of these big reforms and this sort of future model for policing. And I really hope and trust that we can continue that joint working through this process. This is quite a long process. The white paper will just be the next step. And that will come in the next few months, and then after that, we will be getting on with delivery.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And it's clear that my constituents and Altrincham and so people across the country are very keen to see more neighbourhood police officers on the streets, active, visible, tackling low-level crime and antisocial behaviour. So I wondered if you could just speak a bit more about how we ensure that the funding uplift that's been announced really does make it through to the front line, and also how that's feeding through already in terms of recruitment.
Yes, so the government totally agrees with that, and the purpose of the 200 million that the Home Secretary has announced for the beginnings of the neighbourhood policing guarantee being implemented in every force up and down the country is a sign of that importance. And so this will be a pool, a fund that the forces can bid into in order to secure some uplift in their area, whether that's for new recruits coming in or to move someone who's currently doing a back office function out onto the front line and backfill them with someone who can then do the office work. There are lots of different ways of the 13,000 commitment beginning to be implemented, and we're leaving the shape of that at this stage to each force. So the ball is now in their court after the announcements last week, and we look forward to sort of hearing how they will get on with that, and rest assured that we in the Home Office, whether both ministers and officials, will be encouraging ambition across the police in order to demonstrate to your constituents that there is something changing here, that this is a more visible police presence in order to tackle exactly the sort of things that you've been talking about. I mean, shoplifting would be one example, but lots of other things as well. And of course, what the sorts of crimes that matter most obviously varies by constituency, by type of region, and so that is why we're not saying there's a single way of doing this.
Davis.
You talk about the ensuring that there isn't 43 ways of doing the same thing, it should just be done once. Do you believe that that police reorganisation, police force reorganisation and mergers is part of that answer?
So I wouldn't want to sort of prescribe the ambition. I wouldn't want to sort of constrain the ambition at this stage. We're just embarking on something which I think will be quite a long-term programme. But I don't think I think that issue is not front and centre at the moment. So I think there are things that we can do before that within the existing setup of 43 police forces that will get significant benefits, including on the efficiency side, including on being much stronger about what is being done once and only once at the national level. So if you think about policing, there's a sort of national level, there's a local level, and in between there's some sort of regional level. So sort of broadly speaking, keeping that structure but optimising it, making it more fit for purpose so that there is better value for money. And in the end, this all comes down to public trust and confidence in policing. So the mission that the government has for safer streets is partly about reducing the harms that we talked about, the violence against women and girls, the knife crime, but it's partly, at least half of it is also about public trust and confidence. And so that is something where the neighbourhood police guarantee is so important, and there'll be more action in that sort of space, I think, over the years of this Parliament.
I take your point about wanting to work with police forces, but do you feel in the centre at the Home Office you're able to mandate that change, that reform, given the independence the police enjoy, quite rightly?
So I think it's all about getting the balance right, and I think that this government is seeking to shift the balance. So there will be a more, and the Home Secretary set that out to you and elsewhere in Parliament, and to the police chiefs and the PCCs. So this is about the Home Office having a much tighter sense of the data, a much stronger sense of what standards are required for policing. And not necessarily, in fact, not new powers for the Home Secretary to mandate, but just using the existing powers. Say, here is one force who's doing that particular thing really well. all of you do it that way. That's the sort of thing that we're talking about in this first phase as we build up the national centre of policing and work out how to optimise the national, the regional and the local. So we're not talking about taking away the responsibilities locally for accountability of the PCCs, and we're not talking at this stage about reducing the number from 43 down to any other number of police forces in the UK.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And it was thanks for your time this afternoon as well. And I was just wanting to build on the points that Connor has made, just around the settlement wanting to achieve 13,000 as a combination of neighbourhood police officers as well as PCSOs. So I assume there's a cost differential between recruiting PCSOs as opposed to neighbourhood police officers. So do you know what that cost differential is?
I do. I haven't got it in front of me at the moment. But we have got a range of ways of essentially each force being able to work out for itself how much it needs in this first phase, depending on the mix of different ways of contributing to the 13,000 that they are planning to do. And at this stage, we're not being prescriptive. We're not telling the forces how to do it. We're, as I said earlier, the ball is in their court to work out how are they going to do it in their area. One thing that we are prescriptive on is that they mustn't meet this requirement at the expense of the total size of policing. So that is something that we'll be keeping a very close eye on nationally as well as in each area. And sorry, I forgot to answer the bit of the question about the Met, but you're absolutely right that the Met didn't meet its recruitment targets under the last government, and obviously there are significant challenges about recruiting into this labour market in London. So, but nationally, we do need to find ways of making sure that other forces make up for any shortfalls in the Met.
Just expanding on that, how is the Home Office planning on meeting the challenge inevitably where different forces are wanting to potentially bid for a different combination potentially of PCSOs and neighbourhood police officers? And if it's obviously cheaper, I assume, although you haven't indicated the figures, but obviously cheaper for PCSOs to form that part of the recruitment, how do you then substantiate the correct balance to achieve the overall settlement of 13,000?
It is a little bit cheaper, and I'm happy to write to the committee with the precise detail. But the big point is that we're not going to prescribe that precise mix for each force at this stage. We're going to allow each force to work out for itself its best way of making its contribution to this overall target. I think we reserve the right to change that, be more directive at later stages of this programme. This is just the sort of, we're not even really in the first we're not in the first year of this programme yet. So we're building up to that into the next financial year, and then we've got the rest of the Parliament to fulfil that commitment.
Well, it would be useful maybe to have that in writing as well. And just if police forces are saying to us, actually, in terms of keeping as many police officers or indeed PCSOs out on the streets with our existing numbers before we get the additional recruitment, in order to facilitate that, what we actually need is more backroom staff to be able to allow the existing officers to spend more time out on the beat. Where is the Home Office's thinking to allow the increase in capacity to do backroom staff to be enhanced by certain forces that may be requesting that?
So if a force has a very particular person or group of people who are currently doing backroom support functions who could be put onto the front line if they were backfilled, then that will absolutely count towards the 13,000. But what we're not going to do is just a sort of blanket, here's a bit of extra money for your support functions, because that is not automatically going to deliver this government's ambition for delivery. So we're all about the delivery now for this programme, and making sure that it really gets to the intent of the government, which is more visible neighbourhood policing as part of the neighbourhood policing guarantee.
And just finally on this point from me, I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the 13,000 additional staff over and above those that may be retiring, falling ill, or taking leave and having contracts terminated, etc.? Is this additional over and above?
Yes, it's a net number, just as the 20,000 number was for the previous government. Yeah.
Thank you. So I just want to move on to visas, if that's okay. What consideration does the Home Office take into account when deciding the level of visa fees?
Sorry, I might want to come in. A number of different things. At one level, this is a product that the department sells, and times are tight. We need to maximise our income in order to make our budget add up. And in big numbers, our total spending power as a department is £27 billion annually, of which £7 billion is income. So that's quite a significant proportion that we are getting back from our visas and other things that we are selling. But it's not just a sort of, it isn't actually a business. So we're not commercially driving the highest number on it for every product line, but we are trying to generate a little bit of that sort of commercial spirit into the department. We are also very conscious, of course, that growth is the primary mission of this government. So we wouldn't want to be shooting ourselves in the foot by putting up the price of some particular visa that was going to have a particularly dramatic positive impact on growth, that if that was going to put off people from coming using that visa, and therefore that was going to having a net negative impact for the Exchequer as a whole. So we need to think about the Home Office's budget, but within the context of the government as a whole.
Which nicely brings me on to my next follow-up point, is how do you go about those competing priorities to do with controlling net migration, the income that is able to be received into the Exchequer, alongside balancing workforce demands across different sectors, to be able to make sure that you've still got that revenue coming into the Treasury, if not increasing it, alongside the ambitions of growth, etc.
Yeah, I mean, as your question implies, it's a balance. I mean, the government has set some very clear direction in terms of the need to reduce net migration. We, as part of the spending review discussions last year, agreed a budget with the Treasury through that, which did include some fee increases as a balance between that and money from the Treasury in order to fund the delivery of the government's ambitions that the Home Office has got. Where there are particular trade-offs that other people in government might have, e.g. with growth, although I would say it's not always as binary as that. We go through the normal processes of cross-departmental agreement to reach a decision.
And just finally from me, how do you go about that process of cross-departmental agreement? Because obviously if you're putting up one visa price, that can have an impact on the amount of revenue potentially that's coming in for if.
Yeah.
So how
So we own the policy in the Home Office, if you like, of visa fee setting. But as with any government policy where a number of different departments have an interest, we do a cabinet right round, and departments with different views can respond, and ultimately the Prime Minister makes a decision.
Thank you.
You consider that there's merit in differential amounts of money for visas, or the amount of visas are possible, or in terms of drive economic growth. So, for example, very high worth individuals being able to access visas at a differential price compared to others, or, for example, certain industries or sectors being able to access them for free. So, for instance, nurses wanting to work in the NHS, for instance.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a number of things in your question. I mean, the first thing is, as I said, the government's really clear that net migration overall needs to come down. It has been very high in recent years, and it's a clear policy of this government to continue to do that. When we were here with the Home Secretary just before Christmas and talking about some of these issues, she set out that we need to make sure that the migration system for particularly work and study visas is properly integrated with what we are trying to do as a country in terms of labour market, and that we're not just reaching for migration, but we've got a properly integrated system between skills, getting people back to work and training, and then migration where it's really needed. And the Migration Advisory Committee are currently considering the position for IT and engineering industries. So there's sort of policy setting in terms of where we think migration is necessary for the labour market, as opposed to training skills and bringing more people into work. There's then a subsequent set of decisions to be made about where the fee levels are for different things, and we take that into account. And obviously, depending on what's happening to demand, the total net income can can change, and that's what we have to manage across what, to be honest, is quite a complicated set of fees for all the different visa lines that exist.
Very short question on visas from me. Some sectors are really affected by Home Office processing times and the requirement for visas, and I'm thinking particularly of the cultural sector because I represent Central Edinburgh, so I'm not only the MP for Edinburgh East and Musselburgh, I'm the MP for the Edinburgh Festival and Fringe sometimes. Have you ever given any consideration to the mechanics of how visa liberalisation for the creative and cultural sector would work, and especially you mentioned the growth agenda, the impact that could have on one of the government's identified growth sectors?
So, I mean, there are a number of different visas that are considered at different times. We've talked about the high net worth visa route, a relatively new route. We also work very hard in terms of the UK visa teams that we have got to make sure that we are processing inside and making decisions inside the service level agreements that we have got. There are also some priority and super priority routes. They cost a bit of extra money, but there are routes where you can get a decision in 24 hours, and there are routes where you can get a decision within 5 working days. So there's one question about the policy, and there's a separate question to make sure that we are turning around the decisions that we need to make quickly and efficiently.
Nothing on the creators. You've not done any analysis or engagement with the sector to understand.
So at the moment, as the Prime Minister announced before Christmas, we are working on an immigration white paper and how we will achieve the government's aim to bring net migration down in the context of all of the considerations with respect to migration.
Thank you, Jake.
In terms of the balance between visa fees and levels of migration, is that the same calculation for the immigration skills charge? And is there a different cross-departmental negotiation regarding that as opposed to visa fees? And then a more broad question, potentially as a new MP using my right to ask a stupid question perhaps. I mean, is there a document or is there a person within the Home Office who is doing this modelling for you as to numbers? Or does the Home Office rely upon others to do that? And is that information publicly available? As when I say modelling, I mean you pull this lever, this is what we expect to happen here and there. And then, third question I just remembered. The conversations the Home Office have in terms of labour market and immigration policy, presumably that is fundamentally with the Treasury. When you talk about cross-departmental conversations, is that really with the Treasury?
I mean, start with your last question. No, it's actually with a wide range of departments. So the Department of Health and Social Care are responsible for health and social care workers and making sure that they can deliver the health and social care objectives that the department has got. So the discussion we've had over recent years about health and social care visa, the route and the extent to which we have used migration in recent years to support that sector is very much with the Department of Health and Social Care. I mean, sort of similarly, if you like, on the skills surcharge, which is and the money actually goes from us, that goes to the Treasury to support training, and there are a number of things that we would consider around that. But it's fundamentally the same process in terms of what's the right level. Actually, it was set in 2017, and I think I'm right in saying hasn't been changed since. Yes, we have teams inside the Home Office sort of doing the analysis, both in terms of potential different levels of demand for different visa routes and what that would sort of play through to. It's sort of internal analysis to sort of support our budget management.
Thank you for attending today. Many of your answers have shown how important it is to have accurate estimates of costs and savings, etc. So I'd like to turn to the Home Office's contribution to the infamous black hole. So Matthew, under your leadership, the Home Office got into the habit of not providing an accurate estimate of asylum expenditure in each June's main estimate memorandum laid before Parliament. What was the reason for this?
Well, I set this out to the Home Affairs Select Committee and the Public Accounts Committee at the time. The reason was that in that spending review, which I think was the 2021 spending review, the then Home Secretary and the then Chief Secretary of the Treasury agreed that given the uncertainties in the asylum intake, and therefore the costs that we would need to be spending on accommodation, that rather than having that on our baseline in our budget, we would have an in-year negotiation to receive that amount of money. So that is why in the last two financial years we had quite a significant addition to our budget at the supplementary estimates. After the election and in the first round of this spending review, that was corrected for this financial year. So we don't have that issue for this financial year, and I don't think we're going to have it from here on, because the current Home Secretary, the current Chief Secretary have reached agreement on a different way of managing the Home Office's budget.
I see that, and I have your answer from December 23, and you're absolutely consistent in your approach. Were you right, though? Under the Treasury guidelines, you are the accounting officer. Under the guidelines, it says here you are required to give a complete, accurate and consistent... So you must ensure the estimates are complete, accurate and consistent with parliamentary and Treasury requirements and consistent with their best forecast of requirements. So even though you were told not to include these figures, were you right?
I think that we... I mean, it's a good challenge, I may say. So I think that we were clear all along that the amount that we had on our baseline would need to be topped up, and we didn't know how much it would need to be topped up by. And so that is why I was keen to ensure that this Select Committee and the Public Accounts Committee knew that was the agreement of the politicians at that time.
Is that good enough? Or should you not have said to Power, look, no, I have to give an estimate. I can't be exactly accurate, of course, but I can give a better estimate than nothing.
Well, that is what we're doing now.
No, but why didn't you do it? Because my answer is, why didn't you do it then? And are you the right person now to actually say to Power, to government, no, that's not right?
Well, I think that I definitely have a track record of speaking truth to power, so I'm not worried about that aspect. I also think that there are different ways to skin a cat, and on this occasion, at that time, there was a requirement for the Home Office to accept a settlement which did not allow us in totality to be able to meet our statutory obligation to provide asylum accommodation to asylum seekers. But because it was a statutory obligation, we knew therefore that we needed an additional top-up. And we reached agreement at that time, so it was all part of the single agreement, that there would be an almost automatic top-up from the reserve for what we needed. It wasn't a sort of total blank check, and it shouldn't have been, because obviously we needed to keeping costs down and in the normal value for money way. So I think it was a reasonable way of dealing with a not brilliant situation, and we have regularised the situation at the last spending review.
You have no regrets for not providing an estimate?
I tend to use the phrase "with the benefit of hindsight" quite a lot in this role, and I think with the benefit of hindsight, there are other ways that I and we could have managed that situation, but I think that within the constraints that we were operating in at that time, the agreement that the then Home Secretary and the then Chief Secretary reached was acceptable, and provided that we were clear with committees that was the way that we were going to get our baseline topped up.
Thank you.
We've completed our questions now around the sort of workings of the Home Office. We're going to go on to policy issues. I'm conscious of time, so can I encourage colleagues to be succinct with questions? But I'm going to start on the asylum accommodation area and with Belle Ribeiro Addy.
Apologies, Chair. I just had a quick question about fees. Very quick, I promise.
Very, very quickly, but we do need to move on.
You mentioned visas being a product, and I wondered if that was the same approach that you had to citizenship.
Absolutely not.
Okay. Then why is it still the case that we're making an additional £640 for children to register their right to be British citizens when it is in fact their right The High Court ruled this unlawful in 2019, and I know there is now a fee waiver in place if you cannot afford it. However, children are still being asked to register when it is their right to be citizens and paying over and above.
I mean, I think the fee waiver is the crux of the answer to your question. If there are any cases where, for some reason, the fee waiver is not being accepted, then we better look into that, because that sounds like it's not the fee waiver is not working the way that it should.
Since the fee waiver has been in place, are you saying the Home Office is now not making the hundreds of millions that it was before, specifically from child citizenship fees?
I don't have the figures in front of me, but we can have a look at that. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. You had told the Public Accounts Committee last year that the Home Office is resetting its asylum accommodation programme. We want to find out what progress you've made and when we should expect any alternatives to hotel accommodation being delivered.
Thank you. We've touched on this already in this hearing, but yes, so what I said then was that the previous government had a policy of exiting hotels partly by acquiring some large and novel sites, so for instance, barges, former military, land, and so on. And the current government's policy is also to exit hotels, but to do it in a different way with a large number of smaller sites. And so some of those will be acquired by the Home Office, but to the extent possible will be more back into the private rental market, which is where we were before we got into hotels in the first place. So the new strategy, which is being done right now jointly with our colleagues in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, has a greater emphasis on smaller sites and on local buy-in and on greater engagement. Learning the lessons from our previous experiences, greater engagement with local authorities and communities and others along the way to acquire new sites. The overarching aim continues to be to exit hotels by the end of the Parliament. But as we said earlier in the session, the journey is off to a good start, down from 418 to down from over 400 to 218, and it will continue to go down. But it might also go up on some occasions because it is a statutory obligation to provide that accommodation, and sometimes hotels are the only possible way of doing that.
The Minister had said in January there was a plan to close 9 more hotels by the end of March 2025, which is soon. Just want to see how that was going.
Yeah, we're on track to do that. Yeah. I think it's 10 by the end.
10 by the end of April.
Yeah.
Now, but we're on track to do that.
And how many of those still waiting for the application to be resolved are being moved from one closed asylum hotel to another? Because you've got to make sure that you do provide.
Yeah, so we do have to move people around our accommodation estate in a number of for a number of reasons, exactly as you imply. But we absolutely have to do that as we are closing hotels. Most of our hotels are on a sort of rolling 3-month contract. So once we serve notice, we then have a period of time to start to move people to other parts of the estate so that it is empty in time. Some people in any hotel may well be granted asylum and move on out of our estate, but quite a lot will be moved to other parts of the estate because, I mean, it's in managing that sort of number of people and that size of estate, the people being granted are dispersed across it. So we try and move people from hotels into dispersed accommodation as much as we can, but that's obviously not always possible.
And I wanted to find out perhaps how much money the Home Office has been spending on acquiring new sites for asylum accommodation. I know there was a bit of a concern about the North Eye site and the fact that it was acquired so quickly that it wound up costing Home Office more than it needed to.
Yes, so we sent out those costs to the Public Accounts Committee and the National Audit Office. That's what your colleague was referring to earlier in the questions. And we have learned a lot of lessons from that experience and are applying them to this future accommodation strategy. And unfortunately, that wasn't the only large site where there were some significant costs associated. But of the literally 1,000 lessons that we have learned from that stage of our accommodation journey. Some of them are about capability within the departments, which goes to the questions that your other colleague was asking earlier about consultancy and so on. Some of them are about our processes, so making sure that we have a very strict stage gate process that we go through before we acquire any site, making sure that we do the due diligence that we did some of but not all of because we were previously operating at pace, making sure that we have an outline business case, so a formal decision-making moment before we actually acquire any site. Those sorts of things are lessons which we are now embedded in our decision-making about acquisition of sites, and we'll make sure that is part of this new accommodation strategy that we are working on.
But it's worth saying overall, as we touched on earlier, our plans over the course of the last year and the coming years are to reduce the costs overall, and so to reduce the total amount of money we're spending on accommodation, and that is driven by coming out of hotels.
Conor.
Thank you. And I suppose just to broaden the point, really, we've reflected a lot as a committee already on the significant concerns we have about the asylum accommodation system, and I know that it's bad for the taxpayer, bad for local communities, and ultimately bad for the people themselves going through the process to spend a significant amount of time in hotels. We heard again from the Home Secretary, as you've repeated this afternoon, Sir Matthew, that it's the government's intention to end the use of hotels for housing asylum seekers. So I wondered if you could update us on the progress that the department's making with clearing the backlog, first of all.
So just absolutely. So, but just finally on the accommodation bit, I just want to say that I don't think our predecessors wanted to get into hotels in the first place. It was forced upon them and us because there was literally no other type of accommodation available. And actually, if you have a demand which suddenly surges and then is going to go back down again, hotels are actually a very good way of responding to that demand. The problem is, of course, that it never did go down again, or at least not fast enough. But the government absolutely agrees with you that hotels are there for tourism, for business, and other things. They're not being built to house asylum seekers, and so on the whole, it's not ideal either for the local community or, as you say, for the asylum seekers themselves. So getting back into the private rental market as the sort of largest part of the asylum strategy is absolutely where we want to be. But if there is no free accommodation in that market, then you've got to do something else. Now, in terms of the other part of this, which is speeding up the decision making so that people are in the system for a shorter amount of time. I mean, Simon will want to add to the detail, but we have continued to bring in caseworkers into the department and to seek to accelerate the journey through the asylum system.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of progress on the initial backlog, we've built up. I mean, the decision making is essentially a pipeline from setting up interviews, people coming through interviews, getting to decision, and then beyond that, moving on from our accommodation where they are granted or removed. The number of asylum interviews was just a bit under 1,200 in June 2004, and by September we'd built it up to about 11,000 a month, and we've kept going at that rate, which is essentially working from the capacity that we've got, and we'll maintain that rate of decision making as we work our way through the initial decision backlog over the course of this year. I mean, the last published numbers were for the end of September, and there were 97,000 people awaiting an initial decision. That number is on the way down, and we publish the next set of statistics at the end of the month.
Okay, and just to be clear, by reducing the backlog, it's not just about dispersal accommodation, because by reducing the backlog, surely the aim is to reduce the asylum accommodation as a whole.
Yes, I mean, so absolutely. So it's really important that all the things we're talking about in terms of the decision making and the accommodation is a system, And we've got that system is really out of balance at the moment. And part of the challenge is we've got too many people in it, and they're in it for too long. And part of the problem is we've got some, because we've had to build up the hotel accommodation, it's particularly expensive, and the sort of the disruptions to communities that hotels can sometimes cause. So we have to do a number of things. Firstly, we're trying to reduce the number, obviously through the work on border security, the number of irregular arrivals, and therefore some of the numbers coming into our asylum system. We're trying to make sure that we are people are not others who come into our asylum system are not misusing other routes in. So we're reducing intake. We then need to make our decisions more quickly, and a key part of that is reducing the backlog. So we've got fewer people in accommodation. Some of those people, where they're not granted, then appeal. We've got another line of work we have to do with MOJ to get that number down, so that overall we have got fewer people in our system.
And obviously the huge increase. Sorry, I will finish. The huge increase in irregular arrivals that we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years is obviously a significant factor in that. But the huge drop in asylum decision-making productivity and the lack of decisions taken in 2023 in particular is obviously a hugely significant factor in the way in which the asylum accommodation system has had to be flexed up, and the reason why so many hotels opened over the last few years. I mean, fundamentally, how was that allowed to happen?
So there are two different things that happened. I mean, firstly, through through COVID, we weren't able to return, and the number of people in the asylum system really grew up, and that's the sort of first thing that caused the sort of first wave of hotels, and we cleared what was called the legacy backlog through 2023 and made a very large number of decisions, and some of that is what drove the first reduction of the number of hotels we've got. But then, as the Home Secretary explained before Christmas, the Illegal Migration Act that the last government brought through essentially, well, one of the kind of key parts of it meant that people who arrived irregularly were subject to the Secretary of State's duty to remove. It was never commenced, but there was a duty to remove that meant that they were inadmissible to the asylum system. So after we cleared the backlog of cases, in very simple terms, and this is, I'm afraid, simplifying, we ran out of cases that we were able to process, which is why the number of decisions that at the back end of 2023 was running at the sort of 11,000 came right down by late spring 2024 to sort of 2,000, and essentially people who arrived after the 7th of March 2023 we couldn't process, and so the numbers built up in the system until this government removed those retrospective clauses from the IMA. The current bill before the House will repeal the duty to remove and other aspects of that, and so a second backlog built up essentially as a function of policy.
And that backlog and the impact it's had in terms of asylum accommodation has obviously had a huge impact, including on my community. And so I suppose we've obviously seen this government very strongly ramp up decision making, yep, and looking to clear that backlog. Has that had an impact on the quality of decisions that are being made?
So, I mean, really important question, and we've done an awful lot to mitigate that risk, and we're in a much better position this year than when we first really built up the capacity a couple of years ago. I think it's worth saying a couple of things. The first is that we had to recruit very fast through 2023. We've now got we've done much more training with our caseworkers, and they've got more experience, which enables us to have more confidence in decisions in general terms. Secondly, we're doing a lot of sampling of decisions. We've done various internal reviews to test against test against quality. So it's a really important thing we need to kind of keep our eye on, but we are seeking to mitigate that risk in a number of different ways.
Thank you.
Did you want to come back?
Yes, thank you. Just in terms of volume and management of this volume and the fact that you feel that you've been able to get it under control at the moment, we know that the Ukraine Permission Extension Scheme launched today, and that this programme is going to allow Ukrainian nationals and family members to apply for up to an additional 18 months to stay in the UK, which is of course absolutely right. However, when the scheme was initially launched for Ukrainian nationals to come in, there was a huge amount of work surrounding it, and actually at that time we know that other applications were not being considered because the majority of the caseworkers were dealing with those cases. What do you think the impact of this will be now?
Sorry, the impact of
the UPE.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, one of the so a number of things have happened since we first launched the Ukraine schemes. I mean, we've built up a lot of caseworking capacity for some of the reasons. I mean, both in order to be able to do the Ukraine schemes, but then, as we've said, as we worked through the asylum backlog, we have actually built up our caseworker numbers over the last 2 years very significantly. We also made a number of technical changes which were necessary at the time we brought the Ukraine scheme in, which have enabled people to work more, caseworkers to work more flexibly on different systems, and improvements to some of our systems which increase the sort of scope for productivity. So we are able much more to move capacity around the Home Office, and I'm confident we will be able to manage the Ukraine Permission Extension Scheme without very significant knock-on to our other delivery.
Thank you. Now, in the first 9 months of last year, around 10,000 asylum cases were listed as having an administrative outcome, and 11,000 have been withdrawn. I just want to understand what happened to these people.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I mean, look, first thing to say is that withdrawal of claims is a long-standing part of the asylum system overall. There are very broadly two types of withdrawal. The first is that a claimant can withdraw their claim for various, for their own preference, and the second, that's called an explicit withdrawal. The second is that the Home Office can withdraw a claim. There is a lot of guidance for caseworkers around that, and a number of controls around it. There are and it's set out in the immigration rules. There are a number of reasons for withdrawal. So it's essentially about people staying in touch with the system and making themselves available for interviews and the like. And if people continuously don't engage with the process, don't turn up for interviews, then we have the scope to withdraw. You're right that number was very much higher than usual as we cleared that legacy backlog in 2023. Now, some of the reason for that was we were dealing with some very old cases, some people who'd been in the system for a very long time, and therefore were less likely to be in touch with it, and may have left the country, and various other things. We are now seeing that number come back down from those highs. There are still withdrawals from the system for those reasons, but as the cohort of asylum seekers we're answering cases on gets more recent, if you like, it's much less likely to happen.
And how many, when they're withdrawn, just end up going back into the system?
Some people do go back into the system. You can effectively request that the withdrawal was done on the wrong basis, and you can come back into the into the system. I don't have I don't have the precise number with me today, but we manage that through the process. We've also put in place a new team which supports people as we get in contact with them before, a sort of interview contact team, because that's the key place where people sometimes get withdrawn.
Okay, and could you explain to us the difference between a case with an administrative outcome and a withdrawal, how they differ specifically?
So why don't we write and set the details out of exactly how this happens?
Thank you.
I know he needs to leave, so Ben Maguire.
Thanks, Chair. So the Home Office is undertaking to ensure that the measures recently announced by the Home Secretary on tackling extremism are implemented effectively. And I know there's some other questions on the Prevent scheme, which I'll sort of steer away from for now. But given the range of cyber and tech-enabled crimes that are taking place on the internet, and certainly the committee's heard from lots of experts in policing and elsewhere where this is becoming really quite a widespread and prevalent problem, including online radicalisation, terrorist-related activity, obviously the most recent case we've seen of that in Southport. What is the Home Office's role in maintaining oversight of the internet, and what strategy do you have going forward on this, given it's such a urgent and prevalent issue?
I very much agree it's an urgent and prevalent issue. In fact, when you go back actually a few years now, there are three recurring themes that keep on coming out of our reviews in this sort of area. One is this one about the role of online in terms of radicalising people and increasing their propensity to violence, sometimes extreme violence. The second is about the youth, how young so many of them are in an increasing proportion. And the third is about mental health, and of course all those things do come together and have come together in relation to Southport, tragically. And the processes that the Home Secretary has announced to learn the lessons from Southport will inevitably deal with all three of those. The Home Office or the government as a whole do not have a role in monitoring the whole of the internet, and I think that this committee would probably be the first to complain if there were, and quite rightly. So it's not about that, but it is about making sure that there are mechanisms in place so that when crimes are committed online, or indeed when there is a moral obligation on a tech company to do something about it, that there are mechanisms in place that require those big platforms to take action. So that's the emphasis at the moment, implementing the Online Safety Act from last year, and assessing in time, in response to Southport and other incidents, whether we need to go further in terms of more legislation.
Okay, thanks for that answer. And I saw the Home Secretary at the weekend talking to Laura Koonsberg about this issue, and particularly touching on your point with big tech companies not actually taking down content as the department have requested. So kind of building on that, are you working closely with the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology to tackle this? And certainly part of your ongoing strategy, working closely with them?
Yes, exactly. So the whole strategy for the implementation of the Online Safety Act, the additional requirements on the tech companies to take down content in some circumstances, the increasing role for Ofcom as the regulator, all of that is very joined up between the Home Office and the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and we need to make sure that we continue as a government to speak with one voice, even though, if you like, we're coming at it from slightly different perspectives. But this is an example where, if you like, the security interests of the Home Office, the growth and prosperity interests of DCIT, they do actually all need to come together. It's not a question even of trading off, it's a question of integrating. So growth through security through growth, making sure that we are collaborative with our colleagues in other departments, and together we are presenting a united front to these tech companies in relation to their obligations, whether those are legal obligations or moral obligations, as the Home Secretary said.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Margaret Mullane.
Yeah, I just wonder, is the Home Office prepared, do you think, for the increase in referrals on Prevent? So if the numbers do go up or Prevent is expanded, are you ready?
It's a very good question. So some of the numbers are already going up, particularly in relation to those three categories I just talked about, so online, young people and mental health. Now, one of the arguments, and no decision has been taken about changing the definitions of terrorism, changing the scope of the Prevent programme or anything else like that. And of course, one of the downsides, if one were to do so, would be that the system might be swamped. So it's no good just, like, creating a bigger front door into a system if there's nothing behind that door other than what's there already. That is going to be a recipe for disaster. And you know, as a country, we'd actually end up being less safe if we had too many people coming into a system that was designed to deal just with some very particular type of ideologically driven terrorism under the current definition, with a different sort of type of person. So that is what we are working through at the moment. That is what the public inquiry that the Prime Minister and Home Secretary have set up after the Southport trial will look into. That is what in different ways David Anderson, John Hill will be looking at as well. So there is a lot of focus on this issue. I think it's just premature to say exactly what the right answer to the question is, but definitely we need a way of dealing with this sort of threat, which is not terrorism as currently defined, but it is terrorising of communities.
And could I ask, that there is a kind of worry that where the young people are involved, once they become involved with a referral to Prevent and they have a legal team, the legal advice is to go no comment really and just protect your kind of person that you're representing. Do you see that within the Home Office as something you need to look at from a safeguarding perspective?
Absolutely. And look, Prevent is not meant to be a punishment.
No.
Prevent is meant to be an escape from carrying on down the slippery slope towards, if you like, terrorism or violent extremism, and it is. It obviously it clearly did not work in this particular case, but it does work in hundreds and thousands of other cases. There are lots and lots of attacks that have been prevented, young lives, and others that have been turned around. Thanks to that programme. So I think it is really important that we don't lose the bits that are working as we tackle the bit that clearly hasn't worked on this occasion. And being open to both of those, I think, is really important. And so we're not going to rush into decisions that we might regret, but we are going to absolutely look across the whole of the system, because, as you will know, the perpetrator of those terrible murders in Southport did have 3 contacts with the Prevent system, multiple contacts with other parts of the state, the education system, the health system, and so on. And so the whole of the state system needs to come together and work out what lessons to learn.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Murray.
Thank you. I want to ask some questions about the Border Security Command, if that's okay. Sir Matthew, I noticed that you had said previously that it's more of a convening power, and I think you used the phrase controlling mind rather than operating operationally. What does that mean exactly? So what is it actually doing just now? And can you give any, maybe quantify for us, who's in jail now because of the Border Security Command who wouldn't have been in jail already?
Absolutely. So yeah, I'm glad I used the words convening and controlling mind, because that is how those are the words that I'd also like to use today to describe the Border Security Command. That is the intent. That is how the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister have directed us to set this up, and that is what we have done. It's about 120 people, which in civil service terms is not huge. If it was doing the doing, it would need to be thousands and thousands and thousands of people drawn in from the National Crime Agency, the rest of the intelligence community, policing, other parts of the government, and all the rest of it. It isn't doing the doing, but it is the convening, the controlling mind. It is looking end to end at the whole system. So take any particular asylum seeker. What is the country that they're currently in? What are the countries that they have to go through to get to the UK? What happens to them when they're in France, in northern France, on the beaches of France? What happens to them as they cross the Channel and then into the system in the UK? And it is seeking to prevent unnecessary and dangerous journeys where people are risking their lives and sometimes other people's lives. It is about going after the criminality and seeking to put the criminals out of business financially. They are doing it for money, so we have to follow the money, find ways of making it too expensive for them. and there's a lot of work going on through our partners to those ends. Some of it is diplomatic, so engaging with the countries that I talked about. The Home Secretary had a very successful visit to Iraq. The Foreign Secretary has just been in Tunisia. The sort of countries where these people often originate from, that is one of the first things that we can do to help work with the authorities in those countries to create the sort of conditions where people don't want to leave and risk their lives coming all the way to the UK. So that's just part of it. And as time goes on, there will be more and more examples. There are already some examples which we can send you if you haven't seen already, where the National Crime Agency or other bits of territorial policing have made arrests, facilitators, drivers of pilots of vessels crossing the channel and so on, and there will be more of that to come because we will relentlessly focus on this and deliver.
So what are the sort of real-time KPIs that you're using to monitor how effective this is? And have you seen in the 6 months since it's been established anything in those KPIs moving that has led you to adjust what the Border Security Unit is doing, Command, is doing?
I mean, somebody might want to add to this, but the obvious metric to start with is the number of crossings, but that is clearly not the whole story. So monitoring the cost of a crossing is also important, to going to the point I was making earlier about the money. I mean, it is very important not to declare victory too early, because there are lots of other factors as well, including most obviously the weather. But there were fewer crossings in January than in previous Januaries, and we are working day in day out with our colleagues in France as well as the sort of most crucial part of that whole journey, and working with them on technology, surveillance, monitoring, the extra gendarmes on the beaches and so on. So there needs to be a law enforcement part of the response as well as all of that preventative upstream action that I was talking about. Somebody want to say more about other metrics?
Yes. I think the first thing I'd say is the Border Security Command came into being only 6 months ago. We've appointed Martin Hewitt as the first Border Security Commander last autumn, and we're working very closely through that command with departments across Whitehall and with our international partners. But it's still the first months of the Border Security Command where we are making an impact directly, is providing a single focus for the intelligence assessments that we do, that the services do, that the NCA does, and then directing that in a kind of coordinated and aligned way across the kind of key routes. Which is why there's a focus on the route from Iraq and Kurdistan, and on the criminality and the facilitators through that route. Similarly, as Matthew has said, with our near neighbours, and continuing the work we've had going for a while in the Western Balkans, given those routes through. We've directed more money at the NCA, so there are a set of things we're doing which are absolutely our only inputs, but increasing the number of investigators. So we've got more law enforcement capacity and intelligence capacity, and then the sorts of metrics are exactly the things that Matthew has set out. And what we are wanting to do is to focus our effort in some areas so we can do more disruption, more seizing of boats and engines and the equipment, more bringing of facilitators and the criminals to justice. And then the other thing we're doing is tracking illicit finance, and we're doing that both here but also with international partners such as Italy.
Thank you. So final question is that's an enormous amount of stuff that you've just talked about there. It's Iraq, the Western Balkans, France, European Union, tracking illicit finance, working with the NCA. That's an enormous amount of work to actually do. And also the scale of what you're talking about is massive. So it's 36,000 crossings last year. 48 people died crossing the channel. And you've been given £150 million and 200 staff. Do you think that's commensurate with the scale of the task you have?
So 150 million additional pounds on top of everything the NCA have been spending. We have been spending the money we've spent through the Sandhurst Agreement with the French in terms of the work at the border. So you're right. It's a significant global enterprise, irregular migration, and it's going to take an enormous amount of dedicated and coordinated effort. Some of what we are doing through the Border Security Command is bringing together the money and the capabilities that there already are, and then we are adding to them. The money I described was for the second half of this financial year and next financial year. We haven't yet had the spending review beyond that. We are going to have to keep building the capability that we've got in the Home Office, but also more widely across Whitehall. We're also keying in much more strategically with our colleagues in FCDO, both in London and in key embassies around the world. And Martin Hewitt, Border Security Commander, went with the Foreign Secretary to Tunisia at the end of last week. And that's part of bringing the sort of strategic effort of government together at a much bigger scale. We wouldn't crack it with £100 million or something like that. This is a whole of government effort over time to disrupt a complicated criminal enterprise.
Great, thank you. I want to move on briefly to e-visas. Obviously, the Home Office is planning to introduce e-visas, but decided to push it back, which implies you didn't think you were ready for your initial date. So how confident are you that by 1st of April, this system will be up and running and there won't be flaws in it?
Yeah. If I can start, so we didn't push it back, is the first thing. We have been running the e-visa system, and people have been setting up UK VI accounts through the end of last year and since the 1st of January. BRPs have been expiring since the 1st of January. What we have done, what ministers decided, is that because of there are a number of risks with a big technology change of this sort, where we were moving about 4 million people needed to set up accounts and start to use them. We put mitigations in place over the first quarter of this year. So work through some community organisations who we give money to support more vulnerable people to help set up their e-visa accounts, a number of different communications campaign, and then critically, and probably the kind of key thing you're referring to, is we've enabled people to travel on an expired BRP card, and we've worked with carriers to make that work, and that's in place until the 31st of March. We're monitoring all of that very closely. We've put in place a contact centre that individuals can get in touch, whether they've got problems with their e-visa or they just want sort of support to set it up. And then we've got a carrier support hub if there are issues for travel, and we're obviously monitoring very closely what's coming through those centres so that we can learn anything that we need to as we roll the scheme forward.
Do we know how many people still have to set up their e-visa account? Like, is that number known by you?
So it's a number that moves around. It's not a fixed number, is the first thing to say. Our estimate last year was that about 4.1 million people would have a card expiring and would need to set up a new e-visa account, and that remains our estimate. At the end of last year, we estimate there were about 1 million people who still needed to set up an account. That number is coming down and will come down, both because people are setting up accounts, but also because people whose cards expire are leaving the country and may not need an account. It's our intention to set out the figures around this on the 27th of February.
We've got 12 minutes and we have to cover VORG, modern slavery, Brookhouse inquiry and police reform and funding. So I'm going to say very, very quick questions, and we'll only touch the surface of these, I know, but if we can just get some views on them and then we can come back on them. So Connor on VORG.
Thank you. And the government has made it clear that tackling violence against women and girls is a priority. The NAO report essentially concluded, didn't it, that to date the Home Office has not led an effective whole system response, nor had a full understanding of the scale of the resources committed to tackling violence against women and girls across government. How will this effort and strategy be different to the 2021 strategy? and how will we ensure that there are output facing deliverables from it that really seek to further the government's aim to halve FORG?
My quick-fire response to that question is that the priority that this government is attaching to halving violence against women and girls over 10 years is higher than anything that I've seen before in government, and that the resourcing within the Home Office is going to be commensurate with that. And as we are putting more effort and more people into this, and indeed more money than the time when the National Office were making their criticisms. That said, there are some valid recommendations from the NAO which we will act on, and I'm sure we will formally accept those when the time comes. Meanwhile, we will crack on with delivering this government's commitment, which involves cross-system working. It involves working with the Office of National Statistics on the metrics, so we've got the baseline right, and ways of measuring progress. It'll involve scaling up things that are going well, so Operation Soteria that some police forces have done, for instance, needs to be scaled up across all the different forces, and there are lots of other examples like that that we'll be working on in the coming years.
When we talk about cross systems and cross-government coordination, will there be centrally coordinated funding?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Right, we'll move on to modern slavery. Chris.
Thank you. So I want to ask you about the devolved child decision-making for the National Referral Mechanism, devolved decision-making for child trafficking cases. And I should probably declare an interest. I did work on this before I was elected. It's been going on for 4 or 5 years now. What stage of evaluation is it at? And are you thinking about the implications of it for rolling it out more widely?
I think in the interest of time, we better write to you with the precise answer to the children bit of the question. In general, I can say that we are on track to recruit and train the additional 200 caseworkers, which on top of the existing 650. So there'll be a caseworking team of 850 in order to clear the NRM backlog by the end of 2026. So we are on track to do that, and we'll write to you on the children.
Didn't apply to those people, I think, so absolutely, that's great. And then shall I move on to my Fair Work Agency question? So obviously the Gang Masters Labourers Abuse Authority is being folded into the Fair Work Agency in the Employment Rights Act bill, getting ahead of myself. So I wanted to ask, given that that organisation will have a huge number of responsibilities for things like sick pay and minimum wage enforcement, holiday pay, tribunal fees, how confident are you that the Home Office components of it that look at modern slavery and the expertise that you have will be preserved, and the Fair Work Agency will be good at implementing the modern slavery responsibilities you have?
That's a really good question. We will make sure that the GLA bits of this into the new agency do take account of those concerns, because they continue to be extremely important for the Home Office, and we will make sure that this becomes a good example of cross-government working that we were talking about earlier in the session.
Thank you, and I'm particularly interested in that as well, so we'll come back to you. And on all these things we're skirting over slightly at the moment, we will come back, and we'll start with them next time. Jake, though, on the Brookhouse inquiry.
Aware of time, so an update on the Brookhouse inquiry and the recommendations. I know that I think 13 recommendations were described as on track for closure by summer 2025. Just wondered sort of what that meant, and if you could flesh that out. I think that's probably for Simon. And then just stepping back a bit more broadly about inquiries, we had really interesting evidence from Professor Alexis Jay, and forgive me, I've forgotten the gentleman's name, but the secretary of the inquiry. And it came out of evidence for what they felt was a lack of any action, really, between the recommendations at the end of 2022 from the last government, at least. And then there was a wider discussion about inquiries and how that the relationship between inquiries, recommendations and government, and whether there are mechanisms that could be created by which that works better. I just wondered if you had any reflections on that.
Shall I do the first one? So, I mean, in short, as I think the committee is aware, we accepted 30 of 33 recommendations from the Brookhouse inquiry. We have met and closed 20 of those now as of the end of January, and we are aiming to do have all the work in place for completion of meeting the recommendations by the end of the summer. The only thing I would add to that is that meeting the recommendations is important, but actually critically making sure we have got the right processes, scrutiny, culture in all of our IRCs all of the time is really the point, and the inquiry has helped drive a lot of very good practice. We could talk at length about. There are also a lot of challenges and a lot of risks in our IRCs, which we are not at all complacent about. So I think we're on track with the recommendations, but there's a much bigger piece of work around making sure we have got the right teams and the right contact between our suppliers and everyone who is in detention in our IRCs.
To answer your second question, I think Simon's point there does apply to inquiries in general. That there's one thing to tick all of the boxes of the 30 recommendations or whatever it is. It's another to capture the spirit that the inquiry chair was trying to get to and make sure that is sort of living and breathing through the organisation. And that is a much harder thing to do. And which is not to disparage the requirement to go through the 30 recommendations. We absolutely must do that and make sure that we do tick all those boxes. But these are, in the jargon, adaptive challenges. They're huge, and you can't solve them just by ticking 30 boxes. You've got to be going to... And sometimes at the beginning of the process, you don't even know what additional work you need to do to really get to the heart of it. There's a lot going on, I would say, in government on that. What is the right role for inquiries versus for government? How do we engage more effectively with inquiries? I was sad to hear what Professor Jay said to you about what she felt was a lack of engagement from the Home Office before the election. I hope that we're more than putting that right now. But in general, is it right that it's inquiries that say there should be this redress scheme or that huge cost over there or something else, or actually should that be an initiative from within government? I mean, those are very live questions. We can't really do justice to them in a short period of time, but I hope that the committee will come back to the Home Office aspects of that.
I'll just follow up briefly as we've got 5 minutes. I mean, I agree that just the crude recommendations and ticking them off is not the answer. But would you welcome, in theory anyway, sort of governments engaging with inquiries before the end? Because otherwise you do get this kind of list of recommendations and people just kind of hope them to be ticked off, and maybe that isn't doing justice to the spirit of the inquiry as you called it, I think.
I mean, yes, in a way, although, of course, every time any of us does have an actual interaction with an actual inquiry chair or even secretary to an inquiry, we have to be incredibly careful about independence. And we don't want to be going across that line, and I'm sure they don't want us to be going across that line either. So it is quite difficult to engage on the substance of inquiry in ways that both inquiry and the government department feel is comfortable. So I think that's also worthy of further debate about how to do it so that we're not waiting till the end of the inquiry. I mean, we've got some very long-running inquiries. The undercover policing inquiry is the longest running, and I feel as though there are ways of getting some of the benefits out through different tranches, different phases, as we have been, as the chair of that independent inquiry has been doing. But the real benefit that would come from closer engagement on the content, I feel as though that would overstep the line on independence at the moment. So I think we're not doing that.
Just one final very specific question from Professor Jay's evidence. She said that a special advisor had called her, and she hoped that call would be to discuss the contents of her report and what the department was actually taking forward. And in fact, it was essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but to give her a dressing down for calling for the government to take action. You may not want to comment, but I mean, do you deem that appropriate behaviour from a special advisor?
I'm very happy to comment and say I do not deem that appropriate. I did not know about it at the time. In fact, I did not know about that until she gave her evidence to you in the last few weeks. So if I had known at the time, I would have taken action, I'm sure.
We've got 3 minutes for Paul Kohler to do justice to police reform and funding reform.
I realise there's another one.
Oh, well, I'll make it simple. One quick question then. Since 2015, at least, the Home Office has known police funding is a mess. Nothing's happened in a decade. Have you had any discussions with the new Home Secretary about how it's going to be addressed?
So, yes, lots of discussions with the Home Secretary. It's not that the whole of the funding picture is a mess. The model is a mess, but there are ways round that. So, for instance, the £200 million pot that we've been creating for neighbourhood policing that we were talking about in detail earlier in this session, that's something which is not being allocated per the model. It's a new file, and we'll find a new way of doing that allocation. That doesn't fix the problem, but it reduces the impact of a model which is out of date. Everyone knows it's out of date. but everyone is, I think, trying to pick the right moment to change it, bearing in mind that the losers are always more unhappy than the winners are happy. So clearly there's a lot of politics involved in how you make any of these changes at a time when of constrained resources.
That sounds like you're not sure when it's going to happen.
I'm not sure when it's going to happen.
It must happen soon, must it not?
I think it must. And there are, I hope, opportunities as this government tackles police reform more broadly to do that alongside some of the other changes.
And I thank you very much. We've got in with 1 minute to spare. There's a lot there that you will see we will want to come back to you on. And if there's anything that arises that you think that would be important for the committee to hear about, please do write to us and let us know. But we're very grateful for you spending the time today. And as I say, we will come back to lots of matters because the committee is, as you can see, very engaged and very interested. So thank you very much for giving us your time today. Order.